I am 81 years old, and I learned about the sale of the cottage from someone else's conversation, not from a talk at the dinner table, not from a letter, not from a phone call addressed to me. I was standing in the kitchen, holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold, and I heard my daughter Linda saying to someone on the phone, "So what if it's hard to let go? Mom's not going to go out there anymore anyway, and the money's real." She was speaking quietly from the other room, and she probably thought I couldn't hear, or she wasn't thinking about it at all. That was the worst part. She may have simply not thought about it. I set the cup down on the table. The tea splashed a little, and I automatically reached for a dishcloth, wiped the vinyl tablecloth, rinsed the cloth under the faucet, hung it to dry. I did all of this very slowly and very carefully, as if doing everything right and in order would make what I just heard turn out to be something other than what it seemed. But it turned out to be exactly that. Linda came out of the room a few minutes later, kissed me on the cheek, said she'd stop by next week, and left. I didn't ask anything. She didn't say anything. And it was in this silence, in this gap between what was said into the phone and what was said to me, that everything I now needed to think about resided. The cottage. Our cottage. I didn't even know how to begin thinking about it, because the word cottage for me is not just a word. It's not a concept from the category of property or country real estate, the way it might sound in some legal document. For me, this word is an entire smell. The smell of sun-warmed planks on the porch in July. The smell of the currant leaf I used to drop straight from the bush into my tea. The smell of earth after the first summer rain, when you step barefoot out onto the steps and stand there and breathe and think, yes, this is the real thing. Robert and I were given this plot in 1987. We got a 1/4-acre lot on the edge of the community. The land was neglected, overgrown with weeds and some gray grass that nobody could identify. Robert came out there the first time with a shovel and a measuring tape, measured the lot, walked around, stood in the middle with his hands clasped behind his back. He always did that when he was thinking hard, and said, "Helen, this is going to be a good place." I didn't quite believe it then. I looked at this 1/4 acre of wilderness and thought, Lord, what are we going to do with this? But Robert had a way of seeing what wasn't there yet. We put up the first little cabin in 2 summers. Not by ourselves, of course. Robert brought in the neighbor, Walter, who had a knack for woodworking, and the 2 of them, every weekend, sawed and fitted things together, and I brought them food in containers and sat on an overturned bucket and watched the walls rise. It was something impossibly joyful, not because we were building something grand or significant by the world's standards, but because it was ours, the first truly ours place, where we made all the decisions ourselves, where the door would go, where the window would face, which direction the porch would turn. We turned the porch to face east. Robert insisted. He said he wanted to drink his morning tea in the sun. And for all 30-some years while he was alive, that's exactly what he did. He'd wake up before me, go out onto the porch, sit there with his mug, and I'd watch him from the kitchen window while I cooked oatmeal. It was such a quiet, utterly unhurried picture of our happiness. No particular event, just a man sitting on the porch watching the sunrise. After Robert passed, I went to the cottage for a few more years, alone or with Linda, or occasionally with our neighbor Dorothy, who also loved silence and never filled it with empty words. She and I could weed quietly, each on our own row, and it was good silence, full silence. Then my legs started giving me trouble, and the trips became less frequent, and then very rare, and then I hadn't been out there for 2 years. But I knew the cottage existed, that it was standing out there at the edge of the community, that the apple tree we'd planted the year our granddaughter was born was now big and bore fruit every fall, that the currant bushes by the fence had probably grown dense and needed pruning, that the porch might need painting. I knew it was there, and that alone was something, a kind of anchor, a kind of proof that the life Robert and I had lived had not dissolved entirely, had not vanished, but was out there beyond the city, standing and waiting. And now it turned out they were going to sell it, and I hadn't been asked. Not because the children are cruel or wicked. No, they're not cruel. I know that for certain. But because at some point it had become self-evident that such things would be decided without me. That I had been quietly moved to the other side, the side of those who are told, not those who decide. That I had been reclassified into a different category, the one where you're not consulted, but informed. Or not even informed. They simply speak into the phone with the door left open. That evening I sat at the window for a long time. Outside it was quiet. Only occasionally a car drove past and for a moment lit up the ceiling with a yellow sliding light. I thought about how the cottage isn't just boards and a quarter acre. It's the first nail Robert drove in. It's the jars of jam I put up every summer and labeled with a year on the lid. It's the smell. It's the east-facing porch. It's the morning tea I will never see again, but which I remember so clearly it might have been yesterday. I didn't cry. I simply sat and thought, so this is how it happens. At some point, your past stops belonging to you. It can be taken and sold. And you won't be asked, not out of cruelty, but simply because they decided you aren't going out there anymore. Linda came the following Wednesday, as she'd promised. She brought a bag of groceries, yogurt, bread, some vegetables, and placed everything on the kitchen table with that practiced efficiency with which busy people do kind things, quickly, neatly, without lingering. Then she sat across from me, folded her hands in front of her, and said what she had apparently been preparing the whole way over. She spoke gently. That's important. She wasn't shouting, wasn't pushing rudely, wasn't pressuring me. She spoke precisely the way you speak to someone you don't want to hurt, but have already decided to explain something to. She said the cottage required money for property taxes and for winter maintenance, that they almost never got out there themselves, that keeping an empty property was a financial burden, that the proceeds from the sale could be put to good use. She said we thought, we figured, we decided this would be best. And I listened to this we and thought, who are these we? When did this we come into being, and why am I not in it? I sat and listened. Nodded at a few points, not in agreement, but simply because my head moved on its own, the way it does when you listen for a long time and with great attention. Linda seemed to take these nods for understanding. She relaxed somewhat by the end of the conversation, poured herself some tea, said, "Mom, you understand. You really can't make it out there anymore, right?" And in this right, there was such careful tenderness that I nearly agreed out loud, nearly said, "Yes, you're right. Do as you see fit." But I didn't say it. I kept quiet. And this silence was not agreement. It was bewilderment. I didn't find the words. Not because there were no words, but because I didn't know how to say them so I'd be heard correctly. So it wouldn't sound like a complaint. So it wouldn't sound like a reproach. So they wouldn't decide I was clinging to things, that I didn't understand the practical side, that I was, as they call it now, not accepting reality. I was afraid of all of this, and so I kept quiet. After Linda left, I stood in the middle of the kitchen for a long time. Just stood. Then I slowly walked to the bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of the dresser, the one where things live that aren't needed every day but can't be thrown away, and took out an envelope of photographs. Old ones, film photos still, a little faded at the edges. The cottage in different years, Robert with a shovel in that first summer, still quite young, laughing at something. Linda as a little girl, about 6 years old, sitting on the porch eating something straight from a bowl. Me in a sun hat by the garden bed, looking not at the camera but off to the side where something important must have been happening. I looked at these photographs and felt something begin to constrict inside me. Not sharply, not painfully, but slowly, the way the air constricts in a room if you don't open the window for a long time. It was a strange sensation, as if I were becoming smaller. Not physically, of course, but in some other way. As if a part of me, the part that had to do with this cottage, with this plot of land, with these photographs, was beginning to withdraw, to move away, like a boat that hadn't been tied to the shore. I put the photographs back in the envelope, not because I didn't want to look, but because looking was difficult. Difficult in the sense that is hard to explain to someone who still has everything alive and everything in its place. When you are 81 and you look at a photograph of your husband with a shovel, that isn't just a memory. It's an inventory of what remains. In the days that followed, I several times tried to mentally agree with the fact that the cottage would be sold. I told myself, you are an adult. You know how to accept losses. You have survived far greater. That is true. I have survived far greater. I survived Robert's passing. I survived illnesses. I survived years when money barely lasted until the middle of the month. I know how to endure. I know how to accept what cannot be changed. But here is the question that gave me no peace. Can this not be changed? Or did they simply decide they could manage without my opinion? The pain in my legs in those days was stronger than usual. That happens when you're very worried, though I wasn't worried in the ordinary sense of the word. I wasn't pacing, wasn't crying, wasn't calling Linda with reproaches. I walked slowly around the apartment, from the kitchen to the living room and back, and thought. And the more I thought, the more clearly I understood that this wasn't about money. The children are not greedy people. This was about the fact that they had stopped seeing me as someone who has a right to a voice in matters that concern her own life. That was the most painful thing. Not the sale itself, but that it became possible without a conversation with me. That my voice had been quietly crossed out of this equation, not out of malice, but simply by default, as you cross out a line in a budget that is no longer relevant. I went to bed early, before dark. I lay and looked at the ceiling, where in one corner the paint had needed touching up for a long time. I kept meaning to ask someone, but never quite managed to, because asking gets harder with the years, especially when you feel that you already ask too much, simply by the fact of your existence. At some point I realized I had begun to think of myself in exactly that way, as a burden, as a problem that needed to be managed. This was a new and very unpleasant feeling. I didn't want to be a problem. I had never wanted to be a problem, not for the children, not for doctors, not for neighbors, not for anyone. My whole life I had tried to be a person who copes, and now I lay in the quiet apartment and thought, am I coping? And what does it mean to cope? To agree silently, or to find a way to say what needs to be said? I didn't find the notebook on purpose. I was looking for a phone bill. It had slipped somewhere, and I was sorting through the desk drawer that had long needed organizing, and there, under old envelopes and a manual for a long broken toaster, it lay. An ordinary composition notebook, 80-some pages, with a worn blue cover, on which I had once written in marker, "The Cottage, Notes." I didn't remember it was there, or I remembered, but separately from myself, the way you remember things you haven't touched for a long time, and which have therefore passed into the category of merely existing things, without weight or voice. I sat down at the desk and opened it. The first entry was from May of 1992. My handwriting, but somehow more confident than now, the letters even, the slant consistent. Planted onion sets, 2 rows. Robert dug up the far corner for potatoes. Good soil, crumbles nicely. Just 3 lines, but I read them and felt my breath catch. Not from grief, but from recognition. I suddenly remembered that day with perfect clarity. A still cold morning, the smell of freshly turned earth, Robert in his old trousers and the plaid shirt he only wore at the cottage, and which therefore smelled particularly of earth and a little of the oil paint from the fence. I leafed forward. June of 1993. The currant came in well, put up 12 jars. Linda came with the grandkids. It was noisy. It was lovely. August of 1995. The apple tree we planted in honor of little Annie gave fruit for the first time. Small, but sweet. Robert says it'll be better every year. September of 2000. Closed up the cottage. Robert painted the porch green, had been meaning to for a long time. Came out beautiful. This was not a gardening log. It was a chronicle. Small, modest, written without any literary pretension. Just what was planted, what grew, who came by, what Robert said. But in every line lived an entire day, an entire summer, an entire life that now seemed to me astonishingly full and astonishingly real. I read for a long time. I sat at the desk for about 2 hours, turning pages, sometimes stopping and simply staring at one spot, letting memory rise and settle. I remembered smells that it turned out had gone nowhere. They were simply waiting to be called. The smell of currant jam on the stove, the smell of damp boards in the tool shed, the smell of evening on the porch when it had already grown cool, and you'd throw something warm around your shoulders and listen to the neighborhood going quiet. And somewhere in the middle of this reading, I understood what I had until then only felt dimly, without words. It wasn't about the cottage as such. The children are right. It's hard for me to get out there. The property needs upkeep I can't provide. All of that is true. But here's the thing. Selling the cottage isn't simply selling land and a little house. It means signing a document that says, that life existed, but now it doesn't, and it isn't worth preserving. That was what wouldn't let me go. Not fear of losing property, but fear that the past would be declared insignificant. That 40 years of our Saturdays, Robert's and mine, our buckets of tomatoes, our jars of jam, our east-facing porch, that all of this would be assessed in square footage and translated into a number on an account. I closed the notebook and placed it in front of me on the table. Just set it there and looked at it, at the worn blue cover with the words, "The Cottage, Notes." And I thought, so what exactly am I going to do? Keep silent? Keep nodding? Keep agreeing because I'm afraid of seeming difficult? I have lived 81 years. I raised 2 children. I buried my husband and did not break. I lived alone for 5 years and managed, not brilliantly, but managed. And now I'm sitting at a table, afraid to tell my daughter that I want to be heard. This was strange, to notice this fear in myself. Not to be angry at it, not to justify it, just to notice it, the way you notice that the weather outside has changed. So I had become quiet, not by nature, but by habit, by that gradually developed habit of not creating unnecessary worry, which in older people is often taken for wisdom, but is in reality simply weariness from one's own invisibility. I had gone silent not because I had nothing to say. I had gone silent because I had gradually stopped believing that what I said would be received as important. That was the real crisis, not the sale of the cottage, but the fact that I had lost the habit of counting my own voice as significant. I got up from the table, walked around the room a little. My legs ached, as they always do toward evening, and came back to the notebook, picked it up, thought, what if this isn't the end of the entries? What if the last page hasn't been written yet? I called my son on Sunday morning. Andrew, he lives about 30 minutes from me, works a lot, visits less often than Linda, but when he comes he stays a long time, doesn't rush, drinks tea deliberately, 2 full mugs. I love him for this unhurried presence. He is one of those people who know how to simply be there without filling the space with words. I said to him, "Take me to the cottage, once, just to say goodbye." He was quiet for a moment, not in confusion, but as if weighing, and said, "All right, Mom, next Saturday." And he didn't ask why, and he didn't explain that it might be pointless, and he didn't say that the cottage would be sold regardless. He simply said, "All right." For that I was grateful to him, in the way one is grateful for small things that are actually large. Saturday morning turned out gray but dry. Andrew came by at 9, helped me down the stairs. The elevator in our building was out again, and we drove. The trip took about an hour. I looked out the window at suburban landscapes, at neighborhoods along the highway, at trees that had already shed almost all their leaves, and thought about nothing in particular, just watched and breathed. Andrew didn't turn on the radio. We barely talked, and that was right. When we turned onto our road, it's called Garden Lane, the way half the streets in half the neighborhoods in the country are probably called. Something constricted in my chest, not from pain, but from recognition. There was the old water tower at the entrance. There was the sagging fence of the neighbor Walter, who had been gone for many years. There was the turn after which you could always see our roof. Green, Robert had painted it himself, from a ladder. I stood below holding the ladder and telling him to be careful, and he laughed and said that at his age there was no point in being afraid of heights. Andrew stopped the car by the gate and said, "I'll wait here, Mom. Take as long as you need." I nodded and went in alone. The gate creaked with that same familiar creak I had heard 1,000 times, and which, it turned out, had not changed at all. That was unexpected, that the creak had stayed the same. That at least something had stayed the same. I walked along the path slowly, carefully. The ground was a little damp from the night, and I was afraid of slipping. The lot looked neglected, but not abandoned. The grass had yellowed and flattened. The currant bushes by the fence had grown and tangled together. A few apples still hung from the tree, dark, wizened, left over from fall. I walked up to the apple tree and stopped. It was that very apple tree, the one Robert and I had planted the year our granddaughter Annie was born. Robert had brought the sapling, wrapped in wet burlap, very carefully, like something alive and fragile, which is exactly what it was. Together we dug the hole, placed the sapling in it, covered it over, watered it. Robert said, "When Annie grows up, she'll come out and eat her own apples." Annie grew up, came out a few times, ate the apples, and probably didn't know it was her tree. We never got around to telling her, or forgot, or decided we'd tell her later. I stood at the apple tree and touched the bark with my hand. The bark was rough and cold, and it smelled of something musty and alive at the same time. I stood for a long time. Then I walked on, to the little house, to the porch, climbed up the steps holding the railing, which wobbled slightly. The door to the porch was unlocked, just latched. I went in. Inside it smelled of emptiness and wood. A table by the window, 2 chairs, a shelf with a few old mugs. On the windowsill, a jar of dried-out paintbrushes that Robert had left after painting something for the last time and never put away. I picked up this jar, held it, and set it back. Then I found in the tool shed his old equipment, a hammer with a cracked handle wrapped in electrical tape, a handsaw, some nails in a tin coffee can. All of it lay just as he had left it, not in perfect order, but in his order, the one that only he understood. I stood in the shed and looked at all of this and wept. Quietly, without anguish, just tears coming on their own, like water from a faucet that isn't quite closed, and I didn't try to stop them. Then I stopped crying. I came out of the shed, walked to the porch, and sat down on the step. The porch faced east, just as Robert had wanted. There was no sun today. The sky was a flat gray. But I sat and looked exactly that way, to the east, and thought of him. And then I spoke aloud, not loudly, just with my voice, into the air, into this gray October air above our lot. I said, "This cottage is our life, 40 years, every summer, every jar of jam, every nail. I don't want it to be sold without anyone asking me. I want to be asked, not so I can forbid it, but simply so someone asks, because I am still here, because I still exist." No one answered, but something changed. Inside me, something settled into place, like a bone that has been dislocated for a long time, suddenly clicking back into the joint. Not without pain, but it clicked. I sat a little longer, then got up, brushed off my coat, looked around one last time, at the apple tree, at the currant bushes, at the green roof, at the porch railing, and walked to the gate. Andrew was waiting by the car. He only asked, "You okay, Mom?" I said, "Yes, Everything's fine. And that was true, not in the sense that everything was resolved, but in the sense that I could breathe fully again. That same evening, I took out the notebook, the one with the squared pages, the worn blue cover. I placed it on the table, opened it to the last written page. There was an entry from August of 2019, the last summer I still went out there regularly. Put up 8 jars of gooseberry jam. Robert has been gone 3 years already, but I make the jam the same way he liked it, without cinnamon. I read that line twice. Then I turned the page, a clean one, waiting, and picked up a pen. Writing was a little difficult. My fingers have been less cooperative lately, especially in the cold, and the apartment had been cool since morning. I'd been meaning to ask Andrew to look at the radiator, but had been putting it off. I wrote slowly, letter by letter, and this slow writing felt particularly right somehow, as if important things ought to be written exactly this way, unhurriedly, with effort, with full presence. I wrote the date. Then I wrote, "Came out today. Whether for the last time or not, I don't know. The apple tree is alive, big. There were apples this year, already fallen. Found Robert's paintbrushes on the windowsill. Sat on the porch, looked east, cried a little, then stopped." I paused and reread what I'd written. Then I added one more line, said aloud what I was thinking. No one heard, except the air, but that counts too. I closed the notebook, placed it not in the drawer as before, but on the table, out in the open, the way you place something you intend to keep using. The next day I called Linda. I hadn't prepared a speech, hadn't rehearsed. I simply dialed her number, and when she answered, said what I had wanted to say, quietly, without a tremor in my voice, without tears. I said, "Linda, I want you to know, this cottage was your father's and my life, 30 years. Every nail in it is his. There's the apple tree we planted when Annie was born. I'm not saying don't sell it. I'm only saying I want you to know this and to ask me, not so I can forbid it, but simply because I'm still here." Linda was quiet for quite a long time. Then she said softly, "Mom, I'm sorry." Just 2 words, but there was something real in them, not rehearsed, not perfunctory, but alive. I said, "It's all right, Linda," and hung up. I don't know what will happen to the cottage. Perhaps it will be sold anyway. Perhaps it really is necessary, and the children are right in their calculations. Perhaps they'll find some other solution. But now it will be decided differently. Now I will be asked. Or at the very least, now they know that they need to ask. That is a small change. I understand it's small, but I have lived long enough to know it is precisely small changes that keep a person upright. Not great decisions and not loud explanations, but this. I said it aloud. I was heard. I remained myself. In the days that followed, I noticed in myself something I can only describe as lightness. Not joy in the usual sense, not cheerfulness, not elation, but lightness exactly, as if something that had been pressing on my chest had become a little less heavy. I slept better. In the morning I got up and went straight to the kitchen, not out of obligation, but because I wanted tea and quiet, and it was pleasant to want something simple and to have it. I took out of the bottom drawer the envelope of photographs, the very same cottage ones I had put away a few weeks earlier because I hadn't been able to look at them. Now I could. I spread them out on the table and looked at each one for a long time. Robert with a shovel, laughing. Little Linda eating from a bowl. Me in a sun hat, looking off to the side. A photograph of the porch in the summer. Robert painted it green. A photo of the apple tree, still young, still slender, just planted. I looked at these photographs and thought, here it is, a life. Here it all is, in these snapshots, 4 by 6, a little faded, with white borders. Nothing special, no great events, just people on a piece of land, just summer, just a home. But this is the most real thing, what happens not in public, not for history, but simply because you're alive and because nearby there is someone you want to be near. Robert has been gone 8 years now. The cottage may soon be sold. Much of what was can no longer be returned or held. But what I understood in these few weeks, not with my mind, but somewhere deeper, in the place where the quietest and most enduring convictions live, is this. As long as I remember, it lives. As long as I can pick up a pen and write, "Came out today, the apple tree is alive, it exists." As long as I can call my daughter and say, "I want you to know I am here. I haven't disappeared. I haven't become only a problem, only a burden, only an item in someone's calculations. I am Helen Margaret. I am 81 years old, and I am still here." I still remember the smell of the currant leaf and the creak of our gate. I can still cry in an old tool shed and stop crying and go on. I can still say aloud what I think to the air or to my daughter or to myself. And that, it turns out, is not so little. That, it turns out, is enough to live with dignity. The notebook is on the table, open, waiting for the next entry. Perhaps you, too, are thinking about something like this, about things you wanted to say and didn't, about places that mean more than they seem to others, about the right to remain yourself, no matter how many years have passed. If so, it means you and I understand each other, and I'm glad you were here, nearby, while I was telling this.